Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and our guest today is...
Well, my name is Zen Cho. I'm the author of Blackwater Sister, which is out this year in May, as well as a few other books, which I guess we could talk about if you.
We can talk about what. Absolutely, I think we can talk about whatever you want, but let's talk about Blackwater Sister first, because it is super cool, and it was one of those books that, when I was looking through some of the upcoming books, it was just very different than anything I'd seen recently, and it had just a lot in it that I was like, okay, this one is going to be, I think this one's going to be a huge hit, and it's going to be, like I said, completely different than anything I've read recently. So please tell us in your own words what this book is about.
Yeah, so Blackwater Sister is about a young woman called Jess, and she has spent most of her life in America, but her parents are Chinese Malaysian, and they have just decided to move back to Malaysia after a reverse in their fortune. So she's going with them. So she's pretty stressed. She's just out of university. She's got a girlfriend, but she's not out to her family. And then she starts hearing a voice in her head, and the voice in her head turns out to belong to her grandmother, who is dead. And so her grandmother has certain business in the living world and wants Jess to help her discharge that business. And it has to do with a mysterious deity called the Blackwater Sister and her temple in Penang. So as Jess helps her grandmother, she's drawn into all kinds of adventures and all kinds of dangers, both spiritual and physical. So yeah, that's what the book is about.
It's a very unique coming of age story in so many ways. It has it has the story. It's almost like a lot of times when you're reading a story about somebody moving, it's like it's an immigration to America story. In this story, Jess is moving from America to Malaysia, and her parents did the opposite before. There were some really just effective lines in there just about how the whole experience affected Jess's dad. Living in America, I mean, the American dream is certainly not what it's sold as, I believe. And I think that's unfortunately sort of a reality that a lot of people have when, they're moving, when they're immigrating too. But coming back, I loved the setting. Do you have family from Malaysia?
So I grew up in Malaysia. I'm from Malaysia.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so I was born there. I left when I was around 17, 18 years old so I live in the UK now. But I still have a very strong connection to the country. My family still live there. And in non-COVID times, I go back every year. So the book is set in Penang, which is a city and island towards the north of peninsular Malaysia, not too far from Thailand. And that's where a lot of my family live. So I've got a very sort of strong connection there, and it's a really cool place. So I wanted to set a book there. It's probably my favorite place in the world.
It was really cool. The landscape was just awesome. There seems to be a lot of just sort of different cultures that coexist in that area. And so Blackwater Sister is, as you had said, like almost like a local deity.
Yeah. So she's an invented deity. But she's definitely inspired by kind of real kind of religious practices. And the book, obviously, it's about kind of a lot of the, kind of quote unquote fantasy stuff that happens in it with spirits and gods and ghosts. all kind of come from local beliefs, really, in Chinese folk religion as it's practiced in Penang and Malaysia and kind of other places with overseas Chinese communities.
I noticed you referenced at the end for your research a book called The Way That Lives in the Heart, Chinese popular religion and spirit mediums in Penang, Malaysia. Tell us a little bit about spirit mediums, because Jess kind of becomes an unwilling spirit medium, but we meet other spirit mediums in the story who are a little bit more agreeable to doing it than she is in the beginning.
Yeah, so spirit mediumship is a kind of practice, and as I say, it's a living religious tradition. And I was brought up, I mean, what we call it in Malaysia is kind of Buddhist, but actually what it is kind of a fairly syncretic mix of different religious practices that just are all sit under the same umbrella. And, you know, there's some Taoism in there, so most of the gods that appear in the book that aren't made up are Taoist gods. You know, there's some Buddhism thrown in there. There's, as I say, folk religion, and spirit mediumship is kind of a big strand. And I grew up kind of going to those kinds of temples, but my parents were actually always very wary of kind of, you know, going to consult mediums. You know, my mum would talk about relatives going to speak to the god, you know, ask the god for advice. And it would be some guy who was possessed by the god. You know, the god would descend into him, and then he would speak with the god. You know, you could ask him questions, and he would give advice, and he'd sort of, you know, help you change your luck if you're having a bad time. He might diagnose your illness, you know, and so on. But I kind of never personally was brought to the temple for this sort of thing, because, as I said, my parents were quite cautious about that. And I think there's a strand of that in the book where there's a kind of real caution about, you know, like meddling too much with the spirit world, because it can be very dangerous. And so that's something that kind of really fascinated me. So I grew up in this kind of context, but my parents never talked too much about it. And again, I think that was a bit of a feeling that you didn't want to kind of talk too much and kind of draw attention to yourself almost. And I think there's a line in the book about Jess's parents and how their attitude to religion is they sort of leave the gods alone in the hope that the gods will do them the same favor. And that was kind of the attitude in my household growing up. So I was really interested, you know, when I got a bit older, I started reading a bit more, try to understand a bit more about my own culture. I was really interested to come across this book, The Way That Lives in the Heart, which is by a Canadian, well, I don't know if she's originally from Canada, but I think she's based there now, anthropologist called Jean D. Bernardi. And she went to Penang around the 1980s, I think, and did some field research studying these religious practices. And what's really interesting to me reading the book was that it was kind of like, you know, it was like a sense of recognition. I would say she did quite, you know, respectfully. And reading, I was like, oh, so that's why they do that. And, you know, all these things that like would just kind of happen around you as a kid and nobody's really explaining what's going on was kind of put into context and, you know, kind of given a kind of context to me. So I just thought that was really interesting. And I think it's the kind of local, the kind of specificity of the religious practices that really interested me. It really seemed something that was very much opposed to, you know, something that was in the community, and it wasn't something that was kind of walled away in some book or something. You know, it's kind of a live religion that people participate in. And so that's a big part of the inspiration for the book. And when I read that book, I knew I was going to write a novel about it someday, but I just wasn't sure what at the time.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was just so beautifully done. So Jess, she has her aunties, and she's living, I believe she's living with them. A lot of them seem to have converted to Christianity or Catholicism.
Yeah, so Jess lives with her koko, which is the Hokkien word for the your paternal aunt, so the sister of your father. So she's staying with her aunt and uncle basically while they find their feet, because her parents are pretty broke. And so like her koko is Christian, and several of her friends are Christian, and you know there's lots of references that to kind of her Christian kind of group circle, and whereas Jess's parents are kind of Taoist Buddhist, so there's a bit of kind of interesting tension there as well.
Yeah, I thought that was, that was a really interesting contrast, because on one hand you have these, these local deities, and they're, and as you said, it's like it's living, and then the other side is a little bit more static. Um, with or at least, I don't know, is Christianity in Penang, i- is it influenced a lot by the local deities, or is it more like what we would recognize it as here?
I think Christianity in Malaysia does draw a lot of inspiration from American Christianity, for good or ill. That's definitely. I think it's quite strongly evangelical in practice, I would say. Not being Christian myself, but having many Christian friends and family of different denominations and different kinds. I think, I didn't really include the Christians as a kind of contrast, or as a kind of big comment in a way on the different religious traditions. I think what I wanted to bring out was that kind of syncretism and the kind of diversity, which I think is a very natural and just a natural part of living in a, well, I guess any community anywhere nowadays, but in Malaysia certainly. I know so many friends in my family, myself, where there are just these different religious kind of beliefs and practices in the same family, and that can obviously lead to kind of interesting like points of tension. And I just thought it was really generative of kind of story possibility.
Jess has a lot going on internally before her grandmother decides, or before her grandmother just begins talking to her, and she becomes sort of a medium in that way. She has a girlfriend, as you mentioned, and her girlfriend has also moved to another country, and is trying to get Jess to look for work closer to her. But her girlfriend had come out to her parents, and Jess is yet to do that. There is some touching just on the cultural differences. I mean, I know everybody, not everybody who comes out to their parents, it's difficult, but I do know in certain cultures it might be looked at differently. So there's a line about, like Jess is thinking about her and her girlfriend Sharanya, and just how their white friends have had a different experience coming out to their parents. Now, again, this is not to devalue, because I know I myself know several, white people who've had to come out to their parents, and their parents have various, what's the word, reactions to it. But culturally, it seems to be just a different experience. How did you work through that with Jess? She's a very sympathetic character, even when she might not necessarily be as sympathetic to other people around her. I know she and Sharanya have their words, because Jess has a lot to deal with, and Sharanya is like, but what about me? I'm your girlfriend. But how did you begin drawing that whole picture?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting one, isn't it? I think, a big part of inspiration was kind of seeing how queerness is accepted or not accepted, rather, in kind of the communities, I kind of live in and kind of come from, is kind of in seeing how my own family and extended family has responded to it, as well as kind of friends' experiences. And so that was kind of the seed for it. And I think for Jess, her journey essentially, so the first line of the book, as you know, so the grandmother says to her, I mean, she doesn't know it's her grandmother yet. She thinks it's just a voice in her head. And it says to her, does your mother know that you're a bungkit, which is a Malay word, a fairly kind of informal Malay word for kind of tomboy. I mean, it's kind of used for like lesbian, kind of butch lesbian, I guess. And kind of that's kind of the core of like just this internal conflict, where she feels, because, and partly because her parents are in such they've kind of suffered, they're in a really difficult point in their life, and she's their only child, so she feels a real kind of she feels a real loyalty to them, obviously, and she feels a real kind of sense of responsibility to them. And she knows that who she is would be hurtful to them. Now you can say that's wrong on her parents' part. I definitely think it is wrong, but what I wanted to explore was kind of that, how do you deal with it? What is it like when something that's so fundamental to you that you can't really, do anything about, is kind of in direct conflict with other things that are really fundamental to you. And I think with Sharanya, I wanted, Sharanya, like I don't know how clear it is actually, but she's actually Indian Singaporean in background, and she's grown up in the US like Jess, and she's planning to move to Singapore. And the whole thing, they're kind of trying to Jess is trying to planning to move to Singapore, get a job there so they can be together. But Sharanya is out to her family, and she's accepted. So it was important to me to also, feature an Asian family where there was a level of acceptance, because I think you could have a quite simple, kind of simplistic story in a way where you could have had a white girlfriend and she would have been out. But as you say, it's always more complex than that. Many white families aren't accepting of their queer kids. Whereas there are some, I would say in general, homophobia in like Asian communities is higher and it's more accepted.
Right,
it's more the default, right? But you still have like, and I know like Asian families who are accepting of their queer kids. So I wanted that to be kind of kind of made clear. So yeah, that's some of what went into Jess's story and the Sharanya story.
I did love, they are essentially, I guess, an interracial couple, but they're like, one of them is not white. Like, I feel a lot of times when this narrative happens, you have somebody from another culture, but the counterpart is always white, Caucasian. And it was good because it really like explored just a lot more, and like a lot more culture, and it was a different story. Again, the narrative was focused on other other cultures and how this is dealt with. And so one of the things that the thing that Jess's grandmother is adamant about is that there is a businessman who needs to be punished because he offended the god, who is Blackwater's sister. Getting back to the plot of the book, and so he has a son Chung, and he's also interracial. His mother is Indian. He's a really interesting character, the way that he interacts with Jess, because he gets a lot of ire, and you're not really sure what exactly the whole deal is with her grandmother and the businessman at first, but you get to learn about him a lot more through his son. How did you begin writing Shung as a character?
So
because I have to say, because like, I didn't want to dislike him, but there were times when I was like, oh, come on.
So it's really interesting to hear that reaction, because that's kind of how I feel about him myself. I think, Sean is kind of, so he is, for the benefit of people who haven't read the book, Sean is the son of an extremely wealthy magnate who has kind of a dark past, I think it's fair to say, and probably, got his start doing not entirely legal work, but moved into legal industries as being more profitable, frankly. And so he's just like a spoiled rich kid, basically. He's very well-meaning. He's a millennial. I mean, he's probably slightly younger than a millennial now. We're getting quite old as millennials.
I know, right?
He's a zoomer.
You want to call everyone at that age a millennial, and then you're just like, oh no.
He's probably a bit too young to be a millennial now. But he's running. He runs these hipster cafes. And he's really, really earnest. He loves old buildings. He loves history. But he's ultimately like, he's extremely privileged, right? As the very wealthy son. But he's also under a lot of pressure as the kind of heir to his father, the only son. And with Shung, what I found kind of interesting about him is, he's kind of based on like quite a few people I know that, just because you grow up in Malaysia doesn't necessarily mean you're particularly connected to your culture. I think you can, for various reasons, you can be actually fairly kind of alienated from it. And so showing someone who went to an international school, he's in the text, it said he basically has an American accent. So funnily, he's someone who's in a way quite like Jess. He's, kind of a third culture kid, I guess you might call him. Even though he's lived in Malaysia for most of his life. And so, and he's also like very successful, but he's doing fine, and so, but he's also someone fundamentally who wants to think of himself as a good person. And I think, Jess tries to kind of exploit that because she's looking for allies. But at the same time, he's someone who is in a compromised position. So I think he kind of to me is an example of someone who maybe isn't, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of call out of my generation in a way, and like people like me, where he's kind of a mix of a yuppie and a hipster, and he's kind of well-meaning and sort of vaguely progressive, but then like ultimately, how effective is he, and how kind of is he actually living up to his stated values? I think that's probably part of the kind of where the frustration comes from with his character.
For sure, it does. Every time he was in a scene, I was like, okay, you're charming me, but for how long? It was a really interesting dynamic. What about Jess's grandmother? She was another character who just jumped off the page. And really considering the fact that she was technically dead, she was so alive that every time she was in a scene, which is frequently because she's behind the narrative of everything that happens, her voice was just so strong. Is she based on anybody you know? And where did she come from?
Yeah, so Ama is Jess's maternal grandmother, and she's estranged. She just doesn't know her. They moved to America. She has no contact with her, even when she has holidays back to Malaysia. And she basically only gets to know Ama after she dies. And you find out why they were estranged, basically, which a big part of it is because Ama is not a very nice person. And I guess like bossy aunties is kind of a theme in my work. I very much enjoy writing that sort of character, but I've been feeling for some time that I really wanted to write one that wasn't that sympathetic. I think Ama turns out to be sympathetic because you find out about her history, you understand what drives her. But I wanted to write one that was really uncompromising, just kind of mean, just kind of bullying you constantly, and wasn't particularly nurturing, because I think often older women are depicted, and I'm guilty of this as well. Older women are depicted in media and literature as nurturing, to the extent that there aren't people at all. Often they're just depicted as non-entities, or they're not present. And Ama is very much present, and she's very much, she's not nurturing, and she is very focused on her vendetta, and I think she wasn't really based. She's not based on any specific person. I know both my grandmothers were fairly nurturing. I guess like her life story, I would say it was kind of inspired, I guess, by my paternal grandmother's story. She had a very difficult life. And although like I had a decent relationship with her, like I know she could be difficult, not as difficult as the grandmother in this book. But I think that idea of the kind of difficult old woman kind of interested me, like kind of, exploring that character and kind of giving her her time in the sun. That was important to me.
It was great. I think that readers are going to absolutely love her. And I love that she's complicated. That's pretty much something, when you hear grandmother stories, they're not necessarily complicated to that point, or, you're just like, oh, well, this is why she's so grouchy all the time. She's not really mean, but like, I feel like Jess's grandmother was a little bit of both.
Yeah.
She's like, well, she's complicated, but also, let's be honest, she's kind of mean.
Some of the decisions she makes are not justifiable, yes.
No, but that's okay. Like, she's a real person. Like, they don't these women characters, like you were saying, they don't always have to be these archetypes. So yeah, so this story was great. Do you consider it dark fantasy? It had so much going on. It had, like I said before, a coming of age story. It had a story just sort of exploring just the rich culture of Malaysia, and it had a little bit of horror, a little bit of fantasy, familial drama. If you had to categorize it as anything, what would you say?
Well, I call it a contemporary fantasy. Yeah, that's what I call it. I mean, I think in tone it's quite hard to categorize in a way, because I would say it's not lighthearted, but it's very funny, right?
Very funny,
it's
yeah.
fairly, I don't think it's not, some sad stuff happens in it. It gets intense, it gets dark, but I wouldn't say it's grim in any way. So I guess I just avoid categorizing it totally. I would say it's like a funny book where serious things happen, or a serious book that is funny.
It's all of those things. It really is. It
is a bit difficult to categorize. Yeah, I'm always writing these books that sort of sit slightly outside the correct genre.
Which is great, because those books are pretty much like bait for me. It's like the M&Ms with ET. I'm following the threads. I'm like, oh, it's got this, and it's got this, and it's got this. Yes, I will read that book. So tell us about some of your other books.
So Blackwater Sister is really different. Like, it's a bit of a departure from my other books. My first two novels are historical fantasy set in 1800s London. So they're a bit like, I say they're kind of like Jane Austen with dragons and people of color. So they're about, the first one's about Zacharias Wyde, who's England's first African sorcerer royal, and all his kind of many life problems. And he meets a woman who has a kind of has found a kind of secret that will transform English magic, and she is of mixed heritage, so her mum's Indian, and so. And again, and the second book is about, it kind of follows on from the first, and the characters from the first appear in it, but it's a standalone, and it's about a young woman from Malaya who has to travel to England and eventually Fairyland to break a curse on her sister and herself. And she finds out kind of more about herself in the journey. So yeah, so those are kind of genre mixes. So they're kind of Georgette hairstyle, Regency romances, kind of mixed with fantasy, mixed with a bit of adventure, and also kind of, like I think about a lot of different things in them as well.
Your Twitter profile says you like supernatural aunties.
Yeah.
Tell us about supernatural aunties.
So I just find, I guess, well, I like writing female characters firstly, and I think, I often write quite young female characters, but I also write kind of older ones. And I think, the kind of older woman kind of referred to this, maybe doesn't get as much attention as kind of some of the other ages of women, let's say, as much as older men. So I think, so that's kind of my joking way of saying that's something that I'm interested in. Also, I grew up in a family that I think was very matriarchal and leaning, and I have lots of aunties myself, both, related and not related, and, know many very strong kind of women, Asian women specifically. And I think, to me, that combination of something that to me is very homey and very familiar and very intimate with something that is, kind of eerie and supernatural and strange, I quite enjoy. I think in fiction that I find that quite generative.
I can't wait to read every other thing that you have written now.
Thank you.
Are you working on anything after Blackwater Sister? Or are you taking a bit of a rest?
Well, I am taking kind of a rest, so I'm writing some shorter fiction. I'm just kind of, gearing up. I have a very clear idea of what novel I want to write next, which I can't really talk about. But yeah, I think for now, I'm just kind of writing some shorter fiction. So nothing kind of immediately on the cards and nothing kind of fixed in stone, but I'm just taking the opportunity to kind of explore.
And one last question: what are you reading? If you have time to read, what are you reading?
Yeah, well, I don't know how you found it, but like pandemic has just massively dealt like a huge blow to my focus. So I have a huge to be read list. I'm just doing a lot of rereading of old favorites at the moment. So I would say I've got a couple of books on the go at the moment, and one of them is Jin Yong's A Bond Unbroken, which is the second book in the English translation of his Legend of Condor Heroes series, which is extremely famous in the Sinosphere, in the Chinese-speaking world. And it's kind of kung fu magic adventures.
That's awesome. I will have to check that out. The book comes out when again?
So Blackwater Sister is out on, I think it's May 10th.
Excellent. We will be looking for it. Check out your local library or your local bookstore or wherever you get your books. Check it out. Is there an audio version?
Yes, there's an audiobook.
Excellent. Did you get to pick the narrator?
So it's narrated by Catherine Ho, who I'm sure is going to do a fabulous job.
Excellent. All right. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest today was
Zen Cho.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.